Today we have Waltz, and Murphy selected this episode. So, Murphy, you want to lay the stage for us?
Yeah. So this is kind of a continuation, or if not an outright direct continuation of the last episode that we talked about. Um, this is actually the very first episode that I chose. I knew I wanted to do the whole siege arc thing, and I wanted to talk about CL and I wanted to talk about Dukat. And this I thought was appropriate for discussing that. Not only for the continuation of the story and moving towards the end game. This episode is, I've said this before with a lot of other episodes, but this episode is weirdly important. And I think it gets overlooked. And I like it a lot, largely because it's one of the very few episodes that doesn't center on a main character. I mean, Cisco's there, but he doesn't really do much. The episode is really about Dukat, and that doesn't happen very often in the show. We see him as a side character and we see him doing other stuff, but to have an episode that is so heavily centered on a side character is interesting. And I thought what with the last one we talked about and going forward into what we're doing next week with Far Beyond the Stars and stuff like that, I thought this was a really interesting episode to explore and to explore its comparisons to the last one and to the one we're going to do next week.
It's interesting, Murphy, because I had always thought Dukat was a major character, and he just didn't have to be there sometimes. But I always viewed him as the protagonist of the show, of the series.
Yeah.
But I found this to be much darker. I felt, first of all, I absolutely love television shows that are essentially plays filmed. And this was two people basically acting incredibly well
Yeah.
for a solid hour. And that always fascinates me, particularly with a series or that is so action oriented or special effect oriented. And this season of Deep Space Nine is very action oriented. So the contrast for me was absolutely fabulous. I felt Dukat, Alamano,
Yeah.
gave his greatest performance of Deep Space Nine in this episode. And to see him, I don't want to say unravel and I don't want to say breakdown. I want to try to communicate something different, which was the mask he had created for himself be stripped off
Yeah.
layer by layer. And really the only thing I could compare it to was the film The Man in the Glass Booth, which was a film about Nazi atrocities in World War II. And seeing Maximilian Schell in that role, where he broke down and talked about the slaughter of the Jews by the Nazis and absolutely reveling in that, I thought was just a brilliant portrayal of all of the constructs Dukat had tried to put around. He wasn't a murderer. He wasn't a sadist. He was there to colonize. He was there to bring something to Bajor. And he was not. He was there to terrorize. He was there to kill. He was there to maim. He was there to create as much pain, physical and emotional, as he could because he really thought of the Bajorans as subhuman. And I think all of us, I don't know if it's because we knew this episode so well or we always suspected he was like that, thought he was like that, and he was really acting and covering up during the entire series to this point. But I just thought, I found that just horrifying to see that base emotion played out on screen. The other thing was, even in whatever generation of horror movies fan you are, early 30s and 40s, sort of the nascent 60s, Rosemary's Baby, the slasher movies from the 80s and 90s, the movies we have today, you rarely get to see pure evil. And there was one of my favorite movies is a movie no one has ever heard of and fewer have seen called The List of Adrian Messenger. and it's about a person who kills off a bunch of people to try to get an inheritance, and that's the list.
Mm.
The person doing it is Kirk Douglas, and at one point, he in an aside, literally breaking the fourth dimension, turns to the screen and said, "Evil is. Evil does exist. Hitler was evil. There is evil in the world." And I saw that in this portrayal, and I found it just an incredible performance, incredible screenwriting
Mm.
in a two-act play where, frankly, I don't know how Avery Brooks could sit and listen to that. It was so intense. I mean, I'm a big fan of
Yeah.
Waiting for Godot, and that's its very intense play. But I almost felt like that watching this television show. I love the performance. I love the direction. I love the screenwriting. But the darkness it portrayed is something that I have rarely seen. Megan having to build or not on what Murphy and I said.
Interesting. The first time I rewatched this episode, it was right after we had talked about Sacrifice of Angels from our last episode, and the first time I almost kind of didn't quite get it. I didn't quite get the emotional resonance of it. But then I watched it again to prepare for this call, and it hit home a lot more. The kind of, just as you said, Tom, the dropping of the mask and this revelation that Dukat has. And what I thought was so interesting about kind of this revelation of his core evil is that it seemed to be new knowledge to Dukat himself, as if he was understanding for the first time this is actually what he believed and what he wanted. And there was almost this sense of relief, like in his body. You could see when he said those
Mhm.
horrible things. I thought that was really fascinating. And then that led to this really interesting, and Murphy, I'd love to hear what you think about this, but almost like entering the new phase of Cisco's
Yeah.
evolution, because now he's been confronted with true evil, as he defines it. And then that true evil immediately saved his life,
Mhm.
which I thought was a really interesting contrast that I'd love to maybe talk about why. But yeah, I thought, yeah, it's we see kind of this is the evilest you can be in Star Trek or maybe any other dimension, and it is very ugly. And it's it is intense for television,
No,
for
very much
prime
so.
time. And then there's some other interesting things I think going on with other characters as well. I'd love to talk a little bit about with Kira in charge on DS9 and then Worf in command of the ship that's looking for Cisco and Dukat. There was an interesting tension happening between the bridge crew on the shuttle and what was happening on DS9
Mhm.
that I think is also really interesting. I felt like Kira really had a going back. It was almost like a season 1 or 2 Kira, again, making these decisions in wartime in a way that she had evolved so much, but then goes right back to absolutely being willing to sacrifice someone she cares about deeply. But the crew on the shuttle, especially Bashir, people who didn't have as much experience, having a lot more trouble with that kind of command. So I thought that was really fascinating as well.
Yeah. Yeah, you raise a really interesting point about Dukat saving Cisco at the end of the episode, and there's a very good reason for that. And it's that Dukat can't beat the emissary like that. He can't stand to win against Cisco when Cisco is injured and maimed and helpless. That is not his goal. He has to save the emissary because he has to defeat him in combat. And it's an interesting thing to note that this episode is the last time Cisco and Dukat ever speak to each other until the very end of the series. This episode is one of the reasons I like this one. This is the middle, or I guess early season 6, I think season 6, episode 11. From now until the last, 10, 15 minutes of the series, these two will not be in the same room together. And that is really fascinating, considering the contentious relationship that both of them have had with one another. And it also marks the direction that both of them go in. Both this episode and the next one that we're going to deal with themes of madness. And it's interesting to see where both, Cisco goes one direction with madness and Dukat goes into another. And they're both following a path that's laid down for them. But it's really neat to think that this is where they sort of branch off and how the stories are going to evolve around them later on and where they come back to. And it ties into things like Dukat and Kai Wynn and Cisco having to deal with stuff during the reckoning. So it's very interesting.
I had not really thought about the madness part until you raised that, Megan. And what that brought up for me was King Lear. This is my favorite
Oh,
Shakespeare play, but I often wondered why Lear went mad. Can you go mad, insane mad, because you are so enraged mad? And several years ago, I was lucky enough to be in England in the summer. And so went to the Royal Shakespeare and saw a performance where Lear was so mad, enraged mad, he went insane mad. And I guess that's what I saw with Dukat. He was so mad at the Bajorans that he went insane mad. And Murphy, I think you're spot on. And I would even take it a step further that evil can't exist without good.
Mhm.
And Dukat recognized his inherent evilness
Mm.
and that he had to be transposed against the good. And that was Cisco. But I love that twist at the end. At first, I thought there's actually some humanity left, but I don't think there is. I think he did it exactly for the reason you said it. So he could defeat good when good was at its peak.
Yeah.
I also like, Megan, what you brought up about the dynamics of the DS9 crew and the Defiant crew. And I thought a lot about Worf in this episode because usually he's pretty steady staying down one path. There's not a lot of nuance there. It's honor. And I saw him maybe think, maybe my honor needs to be towards my friend, or maybe friendship is more important than the honor of saving those transports, whatever his assignment was. And I saw some things in Worf I'm not sure I had seen before. I really enjoyed that part as well.
Okay.
I think it opens up a really interesting question: is who makes a better commander, a former freedom fighter or a Klingon? And I think because they're just coming, like Kira and Worf, I think, are coming from such interesting backgrounds and with such different ways that they came to be in these positions of command and what different motivations and priorities they have. And it's always interesting to me to see when Kira, who has had such an evolution over the 6 seasons that we've been through so far, she can do the hard thing right away, and probably not easily, but without compunction. And I thought that was really, really fascinating. That's a very Worf-like move,
Yeah.
very Worf-like move. So I thought the way she and Worf were almost kind of on the same side with this, and then the other the other bridge crew having a lot more trouble with it, and even willing to bend the rules to engage in a little subterfuge to follow the personal path rather than the path to victory.
Yeah. We realize that the war is pushing both of them into further and further into bureaucracy. They both essentially start off as
point.
warriors, and over the course of the series, they basically end up, Worf becomes an ambassador, and Kira becomes a station administrator, a commander of the station. The war pushes everybody into more responsibility. You can, a great example of this is with Nog, where Nog becomes Mr. Starfleet, and yes, he's good with the firm he's up to, but he leaves all that behind and he becomes very serious. And that's something really interesting too with Dukat, where previous to Dukat's sort of mask dropping, he had all, and he expresses this to Cisco really well. He thinks of himself, oh, when I got there, the occupation had been going on for 40 years. I was a bureaucrat chosen by Central Command, and I had to make a bureaucrat's decision. Then that mask drops away from him, and he sees that he wasn't a bureaucrat. He was a psychotic butcher. And it's neat with this. It's a very strange transition, because in that sort of master role as this kind of, I was a bureaucrat and I was only following orders, Dukat is always, yes, he's a villain, but he's always kind of this sort of hapless ne'er-do-well, kind of a bit of a boob. I mean, he's the villain, but he's just kind of a goon who can never seem to get anything right. And this episode transforms him from that sort of kind of goof him up villain into something so much darker and so much more evil. He finally becomes the Dukat that we suspected that he was all along. And it's interesting that when he's in jail at the beginning, when he's in that little holding cell, which don't even get me started about a random Miranda class starship flying around with Dukat in the middle of nowhere. I find that weird. But anyway, he's praying like a Bajoran. He's sitting in that cell and he's doing that Bajoran prayer stance where he's sitting with his legs open and his palms up. That's a Bajoran style of prayer. That is very, very interesting. And it shows both his obsession with the Bajorans and Bajoran culture and what's going to end up pushing him towards becoming so affiliated with the pirates later on. I think in that moment, he's trying to absolve himself with the prophets, or ostensibly absolve himself with the prophets, and then realizing that they're just abandoning him or they're not going to answer him. And he turns towards the pirates as a way to destroy them and to destroy Cisco. And it's neat too when Cisco says later on, he says to Dukat, "What the hell do you want with me?" And it's also something that Cisco says to the prophets at one point. He says, "What the hell do you want with me?" And there's a really neat sort of comparison there between what he has to deal with in Dukat and the legacy Dukat left behind and his legacy with the prophets. Yeah, there's a lot of weird touches in this episode that just make it so fascinating. It's one of those ones you could just analyze over and over. I think Red Ocean Raw was the director. I think he did a fantastic job of directing this. And it's just, yep.
Absolutely agree. Megan, you want to give us your final thoughts?
Yeah, and it's just to kind of continue, Murphy, what you were just saying, and it makes me wonder how much of what Dukat is experiencing is a type of self-loathing and a self-exoriation, because he's engaging in the Bajoran prayer. He has the Bajoran the half Bajoran daughter who he loved beyond all reason, and one of his biggest grievances is that the Bajoran people didn't respect him
No, they didn't love him.
as they didn't love him,
No.
and yeah, it seems to me there's this real element of this hatred of the Bajorans and this evil is coming from a place of there's some self-hating element to this, I think, and that's just really. I'm glad you brought those points out, Murphy. I agree. I think this is, as everyone has said, really interesting, really dark, and
Yeah.
it mirrors so many other things that have happened throughout the series and that are going to be happening in the coming episodes, those that we discuss and those that we don't. So I think excellent choice.
Yeah.
For this one.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that with Dukat. I mean, self-loathing. He has several Bajoran mistresses over the course of the series, one of which is Kira's mother. The other one is his daughter's wife. I can't remember her name. His daughter's mother. I can't remember her name. But he has to, and he thinks of these women as people that he loves. But deep down, he knows he has to force them to love him at gunpoint, which is when he comes up with all these sort of, "Oh, we were so close and we loved each other." He talks about the 1-year anniversary of his arrival or something like that, and the assassination attempt that someone put a bomb outside of his quarters. I think that's Kira. I think that's Wrongs Darker Than Night or Death. I think the episode is where she goes back to be with her mother and when she's Dukat lover. I think that assassination attempt was hers, and I think she failed it. I mean, she does in the episode. But yeah, I think, what do? And then you find Torzial, and Zial loves you, and you suddenly have someone who you don't have to force to love. And then she's taken away. It's part and parcel of his character. But yeah, I'm glad you guys liked it. It was right at the top of my list. I knew it was one that we had to sort of get into to go on. And it ties very well. I know we'll discuss it in the next one, but it ties very well with Farming on the Stars, which is just such a fantastic episode. But I think they're very closely linked.
I want to end by talking about, I would say, a very minor subplot of this, but it made me question. Unfortunately, I know the answer to this, but would the Federation win the war? And I say that because a Cardassian wing or fleet of ships has destroyed the USS Defiant and Constellation, and it is their escape pods that Worf is after to find any survivors and Cisco. Yet Worf has to be at the Badlands in 52 hours to guard troop ships, which are coming to replace the troops that have been lost. And it shows to me that the war is still not going well for the Federation. There's still horrific losses, and thought about that point probably more than I should have, since I do know the ending. But it struck me that it was a very good job by the writers to keep that tension alive. I'm going to end with just as great at acting, great screenwriting, as great at directing as we've seen. I think this is one of the probably top 10 episodes of the entire series, maybe top 5.
Sure.
It's universally recognized for its greatness all the way down. And just it answers so much, but it leaves so many questions open. And I don't know how much more delicious science fiction can be than that.